There are chapters in history that have been buried behind layers of discomfort and neglect, veiled in silence. A torturous procedure that leaves a deep scar on Black culture's collective memory. The school system has frequently failed to adequately cover this tragic period of history, despite its tremendous effects on the African diaspora and the unrelenting challenges faced by slaves. In an effort to recognize the continuing spirit of Black communities, this video will shine light on 8 crucial facts about slave breeding that have been ignored in school curriculum. We're all familiar with the history of slavery, including the international slave trade, forced labor, cruel treatments of kids, teens, and adults, and its eventual abolition. Many of us are unaware, however, that once the slave trade was outlawed in the early 19th century, slave breeding farms, a new and even more heinous form of slavery, were developed. The simple objective of these farms was to increase the number of slaves. Since records were frequently destroyed or concealed, it is difficult to determine the full scope of these practices. Now let's dive on to the first fact. Number 1. The profit-driven practice of slave breeding. One crucial aspect of slave breeding that is often omitted from mainstream education is the profit-driven nature of this inhumane practice. Slave owners and traders treat enslaved individuals as commodities, exploiting their bodies for financial gain. Enslaved people were often viewed as valuable property, subject to the same economic principles as livestock or agricultural crops. Slave breeding emerged as a calculated strategy employed by slave owners to increase their wealth and maintain a steady supply of enslaved laborers. These forced unions were seen as assets, as they represented a future labor force that could be used to expand the owner's economic interests. Number 2. Enslaved women as breeding machines on sex farms and slave breeding. Within the harrowing system of slavery, enslaved women were subjected to unimaginable horrors as they were treated as breeding machines on sex farms and subjected to the practice of slave breeding. This distressing aspect of Black history, often omitted from mainstream education, sheds light on the deeply dehumanizing experiences endured by enslaved women. Enslaved women on sex farms were subjected to a variety of methods to facilitate reproduction. They were often forced to engage in sexual acts with multiple men, including enslaved individuals, plantation overseers, and even the plantation owners themselves. They were subjected to constant sexual exploitation, with little or no say in the matter. In her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman who lived in North Carolina in the middle of the 19th century, provides one such account. In it, she relates the misery of being forced to have sex with her owner in order to bear children. Number 3. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women by owners. This horrifying reality reveals the additional levels of pain and degradation that enslaved women experienced, in addition to the forced labor to which they were already subjected. Women who were held as slaves were constantly at risk and frequently unable to fend off sexual approaches from their owners or overseers, further dehumanizing them and maintaining their status as mere property. Their bodies were considered as items for the satisfaction and control of those in positions of power. Owners and overseers frequently forced enslaved women into sexual relationships by coercing, manipulating, and using their power. They were subjected to ongoing sexual abuse, which included rape, sexual assault, and other forms of violence. The consequences of the sexual abuse extended beyond physical trauma. Enslaved women endured profound psychological and emotional distress as they were stripped of their autonomy, dignity, and sense of self-worth. Number 4. Separation of families and sale of offspring born on sex farms during slavery. The separation of families was a deeply ingrained and devastating practice during the era of slavery, and this reality becomes even more heartbreaking when examining the fate of offspring born on sex farms. Unfortunately, this significant aspect of the slave experience is often overlooked in school curricula, perpetuating a limited understanding of the immense trauma endured by enslaved families. On sex farms, children born from the forced unions of enslaved women were viewed as valuable commodities and subjected to a ruthless system of separation and sale. As soon as these children were weaned from their mothers, typically around the age of 2, they were taken away and sold. Firstly, it ensured a constant supply of enslaved labor. Secondly, it further weakened the familial bonds and communal ties within enslaved communities. Number 5. Rewards for enslaved men who impregnated multiple women during slavery. A dehumanizing fact is that certain plantation owners would pay enslaved men who could impregnate the most women, a practice that is frequently ignored. This method emphasizes the excessive objectification and commodification of people who are in slavery, turning them into nothing more than tools for procreation and further undermining their autonomy and dignity. Plantation owners would encourage competition among enslaved men to impregnate as many women as possible, in an outrageous display of power and dominance. This evil competition intended to increase the number of enslaved children born on the plantation, thus increasing the labor force and the owner's financial interests, as well as to further the dehumanization of those who were enslaved. Number 6. Doctors overseeing enslaved breeding and medical care on plantations. Plantation owners would frequently employ doctors to supervise the breeding of enslaved people and offer medical attention for any concerns that emerged during the antebellum period, which is a paradoxical and morally repugnant practice. This upsetting fact shows the manner in which enslaved people were treated as things rather than as human beings deserving of caring attention. The doctors hired by plantation owners were responsible for monitoring the reproductive capabilities of enslaved individuals, determining fertility, and ensuring that the breeding process was carried out efficiently. They would oversee and sometimes actively participate in the forced sexual relationships between enslaved men and women, treating human beings as nothing more than means of producing more enslaved laborers. In order to make their slave breeding operations as effective as possible, plantation owners sought the advice of physicians. Number 7. Inadequate nutrition and health care for enslaved women on sex farms. A disturbing truth often omitted from school curricula is the deliberate denial of adequate nutrition and health care to enslaved women on sex farms. Slave owners and overseers prioritized the quantity of offspring produced rather than the well-being of the mothers. Women on sex farms were routinely provided with meager and insufficient nutrition, which had dire consequences for their physical and reproductive health. Malnourishment and a lack of essential nutrients compromised their ability to conceive, carry pregnancies to term, and maintain their own well-being. The inadequate nutrition also impacted the health and development of the children born to these women, perpetuating a cycle of intergenerational suffering. Number 8. Continuation of slave breeding and sex farms after the abolition of slavery. An overlooked fact regarding Black history is that the practice of slave breeding and sex farms continued in certain parts of the United States even after the abolition of slavery. Following the abolition of slavery, many individuals and communities sought to maintain control and economic power by perpetuating the exploitation of Black bodies through alternative means. Some former slave owners and individuals invested in the slave trade continued to operate sex farms and engage in the practice of slave breeding. These illicit operations aimed to profit from forced reproduction and the commodification of Black bodies. This cruel continuation of the practice perpetuated dehumanization and objectification. In conclusion, this is a narrative that has been silenced for far too long. A narrative that not only demands recognition, but also compels us to critically examine the lingering effects of slavery on contemporary society. By understanding the intricate web of power dynamics, dehumanization, and the commodification of human life, we can challenge the systemic inequalities that continue to shape our world today.